Who or what is driving the world? What makes the world tick? What's sort of ruling and governing the world? If you could sort of boil it back, sort of peer behind the curtain at its sort of basic element, what is driving the world? Some people would say, really, the thing that drives the world is just chance, blind chance, fate, whatever will be, que sera, sera. Other people might say, perhaps it's more chaos, it's the survival of the fittest, the strong come out on top. Other people might say the thing that really is driving the world, it's just meaningless. There's no rhyme or reason to anything. It's just meaningless. There's no reason to anything happening. Other people might say perhaps actually it's more money, the forces of money that make the world go round. Other people might say it's the powerful, it's the rich, it's the famous, it's the politicians. Other people might say, well, perhaps it's a mysterious group of powerful people who stand behind all of those things. Who really rules the world? The book of Esther answers this question. The book of Esther says, at root of it all, behind all things, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, a holy, loving God, sustaining his people and bringing glory to himself. Governing all things, sustaining everything that happens. That's what we're going to be seeing time and time and time again in the book of Esther. Now, before we get into Esther 1 and 2, we probably need to say something a little bit about the background of the book of Esther. The book of Esther, if you found it on page 501 of the church Bibles, is sort of tucked away in the middle of the Old Testament. And that's because the Old Testament is arranged by the types of books, sort of its law and poetry and then prophets and so on. But the story of Esther isn't in the middle of the Old Testament. It actually happens right at the very end of the Old Testament story, right at the very end of the Old Testament storyline. In the Old Testament, God's people were split into two, and it was split into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And the history of those countries was that they both rejected God's covenant and they were both taken away from their land. They went into exile, taken out of the land that God had promised Abraham. And so Israel went into exile in 722 BC. Judah did slightly better, slightly being the operative word. They lasted to 586. They were taken out of their land. But King Cyrus sent God's people back into the promised land. So the southern two tribes, called Judah, were taken out, exiled, but then brought back into the land. And the book of Esther happens after God's people have been brought back. It's called post-exilic. It's a post-exile. But although lots of the Jewish people came back into the land after the exile, not all of God's people did. Not all of God's people did straight away. And that's why in the book of Esther, even though it's after God's people have returned, Esther and the other Jews in this part are still away, far away from the promised land in a different kingdom. So that's the sort of timeline. It's right at the very end of the Old Testament. Esther is an unusual book. It's an unusual book because it's not sort of distinctly Jewish in many ways. The characters in the book aren't, it seems on the outside, particularly concerned with following God's commands. We don't read about God's laws. We don't read about the covenant that he's made with Israel. We don't read about the sacrificial system or the temple because we're far away from the land. We don't even read about God, which, when you think about it, is incredibly unusual for a book of the Bible. God's name is not mentioned once in the entire book. But whilst God's name is not mentioned, nevertheless, he is at work, because in the book of Esther, there are a number of things which we might say, oh, that's a coincidence. That was a bit of good fortune, a bit of good luck. Except it wasn't good fortune and good luck. It was a God who was working all things to preserve his people, help his people, and to bring glory to himself. But his name is not mentioned once. And that is very unusual for any book of the Bible. So as we dig into Esther, we're going to look at Esther chapter 1 and chapter 2 today. Then we're going to have a couple of weeks off for various different reasons, and then we'll resume in chapter 3 and onwards as the weeks progress. We're going to look at chapter 1 in turn and then chapter 2. So it'd be helpful if you've got it open. Chapter 1. First of all, as we dig in to this chapter, we're going to see the world is spectacular, but you can see the cracks. The world is spectacular, but you can see the cracks. Just look at how the book of Esther begins. Just glance down at the first part of chapter 1. The book of Esther begins in a way which is totally unusual for a book of the Old Testament. There's nothing distinctly Jewish about this at all. It begins in the Persian Empire. God's people are far from their home. You can see in verse 2 it talks about the royal throne in the citadel of Susa. This is modern-day Iran. This is far away from the Promised Land. There's nothing distinctly Jewish about this. It begins by telling us about this king, King Xerxes. Now, we know a little bit about King Xerxes from other sources in history. Esther is a source in history. Other sources in history tell us that King Xerxes was a brutal ruler, and he had a failed war with Greece. You can read about that from sort of ancient historians, and you can see elements of that in this story here, particularly about being a brutal leader, brutal ruler. So that's King Xerxes. King Xerxes came to the throne in 486 BC. 486 BC. That's significant because in verse 3, it says, in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet. So we know that, therefore, is 483 BC. So we can date this part of Esther very exactly to 483 BC. So the story starts by being in the Persian Empire, and it tells us how impressive this empire is. Verse 1, this Xerxes ruled over 120 provinces stretching from India to Kush. Just think about that for a second. This empire that he's ruling over stretches from India to Africa. This is most of the known world in the ancient world. A huge number of peoples, of provinces, this guy is ruling over. King, ruler, monarch over a vast empire. If you were living in this Persian Empire with Xerxes as king, unless you were living right at the very extremities, you would almost certainly never escape it. You would always be living in it. It would be all-consuming. It would be all that you would ever know would be the Persian Empire. A vast empire that this man is ruling over. And he's holding a banquet, verse 3 says, for his nobles and his officials, his military leaders. We know from other sources in history, often these banquets, he'd get people together, his military leaders, he would show off, and they would plan for war. The idea would be he'd try and impress them so that they would sort of win their obedience and they'd make plans for war. It seems in the ancient world, their tactic for these things was get blind drunk and then come up with military plans. You might think it's not a great tactic, and in fact, he lost a war with Greece. You can maybe join those two things together. But that's what's a bit of the background here. He's gathering all these military leaders together, throwing a huge banquet, showing off his riches so that he can gather their obedience. And you can see some of that. Verse 4, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom, the splendor and glory of his majesty. Look at the details of verse 6. I don't even know what some of those words are. Costly stones, and the wine, verse 7. As much wine, verse 8 says, as you could possibly want. Externally, on the outside, his kingdom is vast, it is impressive, it is glorious, it's majestic, it wows you, it's spectacular. On the outside, it is everything. There's wine flowing, a huge banquet, hugely impressive. Even his wife, the queen, is impressive. Verse 11 says, she was lovely to look at. On the outside, King Xerxes has got everything. He's ruling over most of the known world. He's got vast amounts of splendor and wealth and majesty. He's got a beautiful wife. Everything on the outside, hugely impressive. Now, just think for a moment what it would have been like to be one of God's people living in that kingdom. A vast kingdom where you're the minority, where your views are really at odds with everything else in the kingdom, where you are just a small group of people trusting in God. You would feel insignificant, wouldn't you? You'd feel weak, you'd feel frightened, because this vast empire was hugely impressive. But here's the thing. Whilst it's hugely impressive on the outside, on the inside it's very different. Because externally it's very impressive, but the rest of the chapter shows us on the inside, it's actually very weak. The cracks are appearing. The king, drunk, verse 12 says, but when the attendants delivered the king's command, the queen refused to come to him. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. The king is drunk. He wants to show off how beautiful his wife is, and she refuses to come. Now, I guess for the vast majority of us reading this in the 21st century, we feel how sort of awkward and uncomfortable and horrible this is. You can sort of picture the scene. He's drunk, he's got his friends round him, and he said, "Bro, bring my beautiful wife, let's have a look at how beautiful she is." Summons her, and of course she won't come. And his response to that is to be furious, is to be angry. And given the bit of the background here, he's throwing a banquet, he's trying to show off his splendor, his majesty, he's trying to get these people to obey him, follow him into battle. He wants the obedience of all the peoples, and he can't even get his wife to do what he wants. On the outside, he looks hugely impressive, but actually, he's very weak. And this weakness is shown then in the advice that these wise men give him. Verse 13, he's angry, he doesn't know what to do. So he spoke, verse 13 says, with the wise men who understood the times. He summons his wise people to him, and he says, "What should I do? The queen has embarrassed me." Now you might think, they would say, well, sober up, perhaps apologize to your wife, let things die down, make it up to her, and things will be all right. Their advice is, no. Escalate this majorly. Make it all about you and make it about every other man, every other marriage in the kingdom. What you need to do is write to everybody in all of their languages, blowing this all out of proportion, escalating this hugely to make it about every man and every marriage. Do you think that's good advice? I think it's almost certainly not good advice. These supposedly wise people who know the times make a terrible, foolish decision because on the outside, the kingdom is hugely impressive, but on the inside, it's weak. It's foolish. You can see the cracks beginning to come. Now, we press pause at this point. I think it's really important in the book of Esther to be really wary about making simplistic moral applications. You see, we want to apply God's word, we want to apply it to our lives. It's easy to sort of make moral applications, and you can do that with Esther chapter 1. You can say things like, doesn't this show the danger of alcohol? You know, people make foolish decisions, and you can back it up with other verses in the Bible. Or you can say, doesn't this show how husbands ought to be better husbands, they better treat their wives well, not to be like this? Then you can go to other passages, husbands love your wives, and so on. Some people have even said, actually, doesn't this show what a terrible thing that Vashti did? Wives should submit to their husbands, and you can talk about that. That's almost certainly not what this passage is saying. Chapter 1 begins by saying how splendid and impressive and glorious the kingdom is, but then it transitions, having said that, to show Xerxes' weakness, his foolishness, and the foolishness of all those around him. On the outside, it seems impressive, but on the inside, it's actually weak, it's foolish, and you can see the cracks. And that's true today. That's true not just of the ancient world, but of the world that we live in. Because in many ways, the world that we live in with its values, with its philosophies, with its worldview, looks like it's really impressive. It looks splendid. It's all that we know. It seems to be run by the rich and the famous and the powerful, media moguls who dictate everything that we consume. It's all that we know. We live in it 24/7. It seems impressive, but actually on the inside, it's a different story. On the inside, you can see the cracks. You can see the weakness of it. It's a little bit like perhaps a nice-looking piece of fruit. On the outside, it looks great, but when you taste it, when you have it, it's actually rotten. It's horrible. You don't want it. On the outside, the world and its values seem really good. It seems impressive. Everybody holds them. The powerful hold to them. But the reality is quite different. And I think you are beginning to see something of that in our world, in our society, the cracks showing. In perhaps particular examples to do with sex and sexuality and gender. The sexual revolution of the 60s and the last couple of decades in particular, the fruit of that, the damaging fruit of that in society and people's lives, I think is beginning to be shown. Or on sexuality and gender, increasingly court decisions in the UK showing the foolishness of some of the philosophies and the world that we live in. The world is spectacular, it's impressive. I think the cracks are beginning to show slightly. Somebody in our church said to me, or said this week, they said that the snow is beginning to melt in Narnia. That was a lovely way of thinking about it, if you know that story. The snow is beginning to melt in Narnia. Perhaps the world, as impressive as it seems, with its worldview, with its values, with the rich and famous holding to it, the reality perhaps is beginning to show. Back in the ancient world, it was impressive, but the cracks were showing, and it's the same today. That's the first part in chapter 1. The world is spectacular, but you can see the cracks. The second part is really chapter 2. The world is sinful, but God is in control. If chapter 1 was about the world being impressive, but the cracks showing, chapter 2 is much darker, because King Xerxes wants a wife. And his plan is to assemble a vast harem of women, as many beautiful women as he can find, and his plan is to sleep with as many as he can, to work through them, to find the one that he wants. This is a dark chapter. This is not the children's storybook version of Esther. Because look at verse 12 of chapter 2. You may think verse 12 sounds all right. Before a young woman's turn came to go in, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. If you're into that, 12 months of the best cosmetics, the best perfumes in the world, being made up by people, that sounds good. Some of you perhaps, not myself, but other people might think that sounds great. Being made up, being made beautiful, the best beauty treatments in the world for a whole 12 months. What do you make of verses 13 and 14 then? Verse 13 ends by saying, she'd be taken from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go out there, in the morning return to another part of the harem. It ends by saying she would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. Let's be clear about this. This vast number of women, they each spend a night with the king. They go in, spend the night, cast back into the harem. He tries another one out. And so Esther comes along. Verse 16, she was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, in the month of Tebeth in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. Esther spends the night with him. Like all the other women, she's joined the queue. She sleeps with him. She spends the night with him. And whatever happens, we're not given any detail. She was obviously beautiful. The night that they spent was special to him. He chose her. This is not the children's storybook version of Esther. There's something very dark and very sinister about this. And this was the ancient world, but it's also the modern world, where the rich and the powerful and the famous often use their power and they use their influence for their own ends, for their own gain, here for their own sexual gain. Let me give you one example, as horrible as it is. This is Harvey Weinstein. Rich, famous film producer, in prison for sexual assault and rape, on trial even this week in the news for more allegations against him. Perhaps 80, 90, 100 women have come forward, using his power, his influence for his own ends, for his own sexual gain. And even in our world, young women making videos of themselves, bragging about setting the world record for the number of men they can sleep with in one day. It was the ancient world, it's the modern world. There is something very dark and sinister about chapter 2 of Esther. But there's something also very real about it. These things happen. It does, of course, make us stop and think about how careful we need to be when it means that we take moral applications from Esther. What do you make of Esther's conduct here? Verse 16 and 17. Spending a night with the king, joining many of the other people. Taken from her place. What do you think of Mordecai, for example? Mordecai encouraging her to do so. Verse 11 says, Mordecai checked on her to find out what was happening to her. This is dark, isn't it? There's something very sinister about this. This man using his power abusing his situation for these young women. What do we make of this? What do we make of Mordecai, for example? Verse 5, we're told about Mordecai. Verse 5 says he's of the tribe of Benjamin. That's going to be important later on in the story. We're told, though, verse 10 and verse 20, Esther had not revealed her nationality because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Verse 20 says again, Esther had kept her secret, her family background, because Mordecai had told her not to do so. What do you make of that example? Mordecai is Esther's cousin. He's bringing Esther up because Esther's lost her parents. Mordecai's advice to Esther is, don't tell them you're one of God's people. Don't tell them you're one of God's people. Don't stand out, fit into the crowd. What do you make of that advice to Esther? Is that good advice? Perhaps if you're being generous to Mordecai, you might say, well, there was perhaps a wisdom to it. But generally speaking, you wouldn't give the advice to somebody, you're going to a new place, you're moving to a new town, get a new job, don't tell them you're a Christian, whatever you do. Don't stand out as one of God's people. Is that good advice that Mordecai gave to Esther? It's hard to see that. What do we do with this chapter? How do we respond to it? Well, the story of Esther is not don't be like Mordecai or be like Mordecai or don't be like Xerxes or be like Esther. Primarily, it's a story of God using even the very worst things, even the most awful things imaginable, to protect his people and to govern all things and bring glory to himself. Because aren't you glad that even the sin of Xerxes, even the very mixed motives perhaps of Mordecai, even all the dark things that happen in this chapter, God uses for a purpose? The things that we do wrong, perhaps the mixed motives that we have, the things that we stuff up in, or perhaps have made mistakes, none of that can derail God's plan for his people. In two ways, in us and through us. Because God has promised for all those trusting in Jesus, all those looking to his Son, God will change them, transform them, and present them on that final day spotless in his sight. He has committed himself. He's begun a good work in you. He will complete it on that final day. And nothing that happens to us or nothing that we contribute can derail God's plan. Because who really rules the world? God is the one who is ruling and governing all things. And not just in us, but through us. Because God's plan is to build his kingdom. That the kingdom of God would advance, that the church would go out, and to do that through his people. And even the mixed motives that we might have, even the mistakes we might have made, God will use us. He will encourage us. He will help us to be a blessing to others. The book of Esther is going to show us God's plan cannot be derailed by Xerxes, by anybody else. Because God will protect his people. He will keep them, and he will bring glory to himself. And he will do that through saving, through salvation. The chapter ends by Mordecai uncovering this conspiracy, this assassination attempt. It just happens to be, Mordecai is fairly insignificant in this story at this point. He's the cousin of the queen. Mordecai's weak. He's a Jewish man in the minority compared to the Persian men. Mordecai happens to overhear this assassination attempt. Bit of good fortune for Xerxes. Mordecai happens to hear it, he reports it, and Xerxes' life is saved. We know later on Xerxes was actually assassinated by those close to him. But at this point, there's another assassination attempt, and it's foiled, it's thwarted, because Mordecai has heard it. God uses here this weak Jewish man to save. Xerxes is saved not by his own power, not by his own might, not by his own army, but by this Jewish man. Because the book of Esther is a great reversal A great reversal of what looks weak and foolish and insignificant in the eyes of the world to shame the strong. In this book, the strong are the men, particularly the Persian men. The weak are the Jewish people, and particularly a Jewish woman. And yet God is going to use the weak, the Jewish woman, to become queen to shame the strong, to win the victory. And here, Mordecai, in a position of weakness, in this great reversal, brings salvation, saves the king. And that really is a story of Esther in a nutshell. God using the weak to shame the strong and to bring salvation. It's not just the story of Esther, it's the story of the whole Bible. It's the message of the cross. God using what appears to be weak to shame the strong. What appears to be weak and insignificant, a Jewish man dying 2,000 years ago, is actually the means that God will use to bring salvation. The cross seems weak, it seems folly, and yet actually it's the true wisdom and the true strength, because God, through the cross, will bring salvation to the world. The story of Esther is God using all things to protect his people and to bring glory to himself. That really is the message of the whole of the Scriptures, that God cares for his people and he will bring glory to himself, and nothing or no one can thwart that plan. Let's pray.